Tonight, we're live at the Vatican after a day of high ceremony and deep emotion at the funeral of Pope Francis. Ritual in keeping with the Church's traditions, but with references to Pope Francis's personal humility in the presence of many of the world's most powerful leaders. But in a break with predecessors, Pope Francis's coffin was driven through Rome to the delight of tens of thousands of people to a final resting place away from the Vatican. Earlier in the Vatican, startling diplomacy, an extraordinary surprise meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, their first since their bitter White House row.
Also on the programme, Virginia Giuffre takes her own life, the woman who had accused Prince Andrew of sexual abuse. And for the fourth year in a row, Celtic are Scottish Premiership champions.
Good evening and welcome to the Vatican, where the funeral of Pope Francis, who led the Catholic Church for 12 years, has taken place. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered for the Mass, filling St. Peter's Square behind me and the surrounding streets. They included royalty and heads of state, but also people who were close to the Pope's heart, the homeless and refugees. Pope Francis's coffin was then carried on a white converted Pope-mobile to his favourite church in Rome, where he was laid to rest in a private ceremony.
Named after the apostle considered by Catholics to be the first pope, the basilica's curved colonnades representing the open arms of an embrace. This was the spectacular backdrop for the farewell to the 266th Pope. Inside the Basilica, ahead of the funeral mass, a last chance for visiting dignitaries, including the Prince of Wales, to pay their respects. Sir Keir Starmer, one of dozens of world leaders in attendance. There was applause in the crowd when President Zelensky appeared. But by mid-morning, the invited guests took their seats. Clergy on the right looking out, politicians and sovereigns on the left. But other guests invited at Pope Francis' request included prison inmates, migrants and torture victims. On the streets around St. Peter's Square, 250,000 others waited. And then, to start proceedings, the body of Pope Francis was brought through the basilica. In the coffin with him, his mitre or papal hat, his pastoral staff or crozier, and a scroll, a written record of his life and pontificate. There was gentle, spontaneous applause through the huge crowds as the coffin emerged into the light. Its 14 pallbearers taking it to the front of this breathtaking arena. Presenting it to the world, but not on a platform, Pope Francis had asked that his coffin be placed on the ground.
Dominus pascit me, et nihil mihi derit.
Although elements of the funeral have been simplified following instructions left by Pope Francis himself, the magnitude of the moment is still reflected in the ritual and tradition and spectacle on this stunning stage. It was 91-year-old Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re who presided over the Mass and delivered the homily, reflecting on the things Pope Francis cared about, his opposition to war, his passion for the environment and for the dignity of migrants. He mentioned some notable papal trips. It is significant that Pope Francis' first journey was to Lampedusa, he says, an island that symbolises the tragedy of migration, with thousands of people drowning at sea, as well as the celebration of a Mass on the border between Mexico and the United States. At talk of these causes, the crowd applauded, though there may have been discomfort for some politicians. At the end of the Mass, there was a final blessing for Pope Francis. But he wasn't going to be buried at St. Peter's like other popes, but would instead be taken in a converted Pope-mobile to his favourite spot at a different basilica in the centre of Rome. More than 150,000 people lined the streets to say goodbye, a nod to the connection he had to the masses. At the Pope's destination, a group of people from homeless centres waited to welcome him. So too did the clergy who'd participate in the final part of today's ceremonies. Away from the gaze of the public, the late Pope was laid to rest in a tomb inscribed with just one word, the Latin version of his chosen name, Franciscus.
Aleem Maqbool reporting there. Well, before the funeral, President Zelensky and President Trump held a brief meeting in the Vatican.
President Zelensky said today's meeting, on the sidelines of the funeral of a pope who had always called for peace, had the potential to be historic. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Let's get a final word now from Aleem Maqbool. Aleem, an extraordinary day here today in Rome. Things will turn shortly to the finding of a successor to Pope Francis, but first of all, what a day we've witnessed.
What grandeur, what poignancy, the sights, the sounds of the Sistine Chapel choir. But for me, a lot of what stood out was the way in which the public interacted in this funeral. He was, after all, a man who had a profound connection with the public. So there's moments when the crowds here cheered at themes that the Pope Francis cared about were mentioned in the homily. The way they lined the streets, the groups he invited to be guests in the funeral, and those who greeted him at the basilica where he was buried. But now there is the start of an official 9 days of mourning, after which, yes, there will be the conclave, where 135 cardinals get together and decide Pope Francis' successor. That's not to say some of those conversations aren't already happening around Rome as we speak, dinners and coffees and so on. But for today, I think for most people here, from what they were telling us, this has been a moment to celebrate, to give thanks, and to remember the life and legacy of Pope Francis.
Thank you very much. Aleem Maqbool, our religion editor. That's it from us for now. Now back to Luxmy in the studio.
Reeta, thank you. Now let's return to Reeta at the Vatican.
Luxmy, thank you. Well, while Pope Francis's funeral was simpler than that of those of his predecessors, it was still a spectacle of ceremony and tradition under the bright blue skies in Rome. We'll leave you with a few images of this morning's events. Good night.